Chapter 4. Survey Research and Sampling. First, let's tackle about survey research. Literally, survey means to look at, or to see over or beyond, or in other words, to observe. From the given illustration, the larger group is known as a population, while the subgroup referred to as the sample. The observations and measurements made during survey research will generate data and information. How does survey research differ from other methods? For example, survey research used to gather contemporary data. Historical research primarily concerned with past data. In contrast to experimental research, survey research is less vigorous than experimental research, useful for studying large number of cases, studying personal factors, and for explanatory analysis of relationships. Types of survey studies. 1. Is exploratory survey, often conducted as qualitative research. It can help clarify concepts, establish priorities for future research, identify new problems, gather information with practical applications. Specific types of exploratory research: literature survey, experience survey, analysis of insight-stimulating examples, analytical and descriptive studies. Analytical survey method is appropriate for data that are quantitative in nature and that need statistical assistance to extract their meaning. Golden listed 9 different types of surveys: cross-sectional study, trend study, cohort study, panel study, approximation of a longitudinal study, parallel sample study, contextual study, sociometric study, critical incident study. Basic purpose of descriptive surveys. The basic purposes of descriptive surveys usually are to describe characteristics of the population of interest, estimate proportions in the population, make specific predictions, and test association. Basic steps of survey research. 1. Formulating objectives. 2. Selecting data collection techniques. 3. Selecting the sample. 4. Collecting the data. 5. Analyzing and interpreting the results. Survey research design. A common design for survey research, and one that facilitates the analysis of relationships, is known as the static group comparison. Survey research tends to be relatively inexpensive, at least if the sample or population being surveyed is not large, but it is still often desirable to reduce the costs. When you conduct research about a group of people, it's rarely possible to collect data from every person in that group. Instead, you select a sample. The process of identifying the representative group of subjects from the population is called as sampling. Basic terms and concepts. Universe. The theoretical aggregation of all units or elements that apply to a particular survey. Population. The total of all cases that conform to a pre-specified criterion or set of criteria. It is more specific or better defined than a universe, and ISIN affect a designated part of a universe. Population stratum. A subdivision of a population based on one or more specifications or characteristics. Element. An individual member or unit of a population. Census. A count or survey of all the elements of a population and the determination of the distribution of their characteristics. Sample. A selection of units from the total population to be studied. Case. An individual member of the sample. Sampling frame. The actual list of units from which the sample, or some part of the sample, is selected. It is often used interchangeably with population list. It is useful to distinguish between 2 basic types of sampling methods: probability sampling and non-probability sampling. Probability sampling is defined as a sampling technique in which the researcher chooses samples from a larger population using a method based on the theory of probability. For a participant to be considered as a probability sample, he or she must be selected using a random selection. Major types of probability sampling. Simple random sampling is the basic sampling method of survey research. The technique of simple random sampling gives each element and the population an equal chance of being included in the sample. A method of selecting a random sample that is considered by most to be as reliable and accurate as simple random sampling is systematic sampling. This technique involves taking every nth element from a list until the total list has been sampled. In selecting a stratified random sample, one must first divide all of the population elements into groups or categories and then draw independent random samples from each group or stratum. This technique represents a modification of simple and systematic random sampling in that it reduces the number of cassettes needed to achieve a given degree of accuracy or representativeness. Essentially, the technique of cluster sampling involves dividing a population into clusters or groups and then drawing a sample of those clusters. In fact, the population might already be grouped into subpopulations, and cluster sampling becomes merely a matter of compiling a list of the subpopulations, or clusters. Non-probability sampling. A non-probability sample is one in which a case and a sample is chosen in such a manner that it gives you information for the sample itself, and makes it possible to generalize the findings for the population with certain degree of precision. Different types of non-probability sampling. Accidental sampling. In utilizing an accidental sampling technique, the researcher simply selects cases that are at hand until the sample reaches a desired, designated size. Quota sampling. Quota sampling is the same as accidental sampling except that it takes steps to ensure that the significant, diverse elements of the population are included. Snowball sampling. Some refer to as accidental sampling. It is an appropriate method to use when members of the population are difficult to identify and locate, such as migrants and homeless individuals. This type of non-probability sampling is used in exploratory research since the technique can result in samples with questionable representativeness. Purposive sampling. Purposive sampling, also known as judgmental, selective, or subjective sampling, is a form of sampling in which researchers rely on their own judgment when choosing members of the population. Self-selected sample. A self-selected sample is a group of cases, usually people, who have essentially selected themselves for inclusion in a study. Incomplete sample. The sample may have been drawn randomly, but as the faulty list was in effect biased or not fully representative of the population. How to determine sample size. First, use the formula, where n equals sample size, S equals standard deviation of the variable or characteristic of the population estimated, and 1U1x equals standard error of the mean or sampling error. So, let's proceed now to sampling error. Formulas are also available for estimating the sampling error or, as it is often referred to, the standard error of the mean. The standard error of the mean represents how much the average of the means of an infinite number of samples drawn from a population deviates from the actual mean of that sample population. Non-sampling error. The information gathered from a sample can be inaccurate not only as a result of the inaccuracy or the lack of representativeness of the sample but Alzheimer's of measurement. So, that's all for today. Again, this is Mariel M. Vince from Non-Escost. See you next time. I love you all.